Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event, which we are very, very excited about on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, of course. So a huge thank you to everyone near and far who's joined us. I know some of you have got up very early Eastern time to be here, and some of you are giving up your lunch break, so thank you. I'm Catherine Anderson. I'm the Chief Executive at the Jo Cox Foundation, and we're thrilled to be partnering with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. We, of course, admire their work hugely, and we've wanted to partner with them for a long time. So this is really exciting for us. And this is obviously an extraordinary year. It's absolutely right that the UN should be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on women as we start the 16 days of activism. We know that it's provoked terrible impacts on women in the form of increased domestic violence, in terms of women on the front line of this epidemic. And that is a brilliant campaign that we encourage you to all get involved in. I'm sure you already are, though. And I don't need to tell you that violence against women and girls takes many forms. And today we're looking specifically at a relatively new global problem, which is violence against women in politics. And that is the name of the brilliant new book from Professor Lena Krook, who's here today from Rutgers University. We're honoured to have her here, and we're honoured to have a truly impressive panel who I will introduce as we proceed through the event. So I will hand over to Mona in a second, but just to introduce Mona, she is a Professor of Political Science at Rutgers. She's chair of the Women in Politics PhD programme. Her first award-winning book was Quotas for Women in Politics, Gender and Candidate Selection Reform Worldwide, which is something I'm fascinated by. And since then, she's written or co-edited many, many more publications on varied issues around gender, politics, and institutions. Her current research is around the global diffusion and impact of electoral quotas for women, as well as, of course, this rising global phenomenon of violence against women in politics. So Mona is going to present to us first on the book, and the panel will then have a chance to reflect with their comments, and we will then open it up to answering some of your questions and hearing some of your questions live. So thank you so much for being here. And Mona, I will hand over to you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my my presentation, short presentation that sorry, do you see it? Yes, okay. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you about my new book, which was just published in September by Oxford University Press. And the book really seeks to really address some of the ongoing global conversations about violence against women in politics. Really tries to think about how we could develop a common language to talk about this problem, and also to think about ways that we might go about trying to address and to solve it. So the book itself addresses 4 main questions, which is, where did the concept of violence against women in politics come from? How are we starting to talk about this issue? How is it different from other forms of violence in politics? What does it look like in different parts of the world? And then finally, what can be done to address it? And why does it matter that we take steps to stop it? So I'm mainly going to focus on the last of these questions, but I'll just give you a flavor of some of the other parts of the book, because I think it can help inform some of our conversations during this event. Okay, so where did it come from? Well, we know that a lot of women's experiences, especially with gender inequality, are often problems with no name. And so this is also a problem, violence against women in politics, that has long existed, but we didn't really have a name for this problem. But over the last 20 years, we've seen it emerge in different parts of the globe as women have really tried to start to articulate their experiences and to really think about what we could call this problem. Around the year 2000 in Bolivia, a network of locally elected women started to talk about what they called political harassment and violence against women. In the mid-2000s, there was a group of female politicians in South Asia that convened a series of seminars where they talked about violence against women in politics. And finally, around 2007, 2008, in Kenya, in the wake of a very contested election there, practitioners, activists on the ground started to talk about electoral gender-based violence. So they all use a slightly different term to describe this problem, but it really tried to capture this idea that there was this form of violence, harassment, resistance to women's political participation that was linked somehow to the fact that they were women. So what we see is that global actors started to sort of try to connect these debates, which had really sort of grown up from women's, I think organically from women's experiences on the ground, and really tried to sort of connect them to say this is actually something that's not unique to a particular country. But in the early stages, this was really something thought about as a problem that particularly affected women in the global South. But over the last 10 years, we're starting to see more and more women across the global North also start to talk about this issue, right? So we can think about Julia Gillard's famous misogyny speech in the Australian Parliament. We see the murder of Jo Cox, and then of course the contested 2016 elections in the United States, which were later followed by the Me Too movement. So these were, I think, developments that were very important in showing that violence against women in politics was a problem that affected women in all countries, right? Just like violence against women affects women in all social groups, all backgrounds, all places around the world. So this is a problem that affects women across the globe. Okay, so then the second part of the book really tries to think about how we could develop a common language around this problem. And I think it's helpful to start thinking about what do we mean by violence? And, you know, the often, I think, everyday understanding of violence thinks about it as physical violence, physical attacks. But there's growing work in academia that argues that we shouldn't just use this minimalistic definition. We should think about violence in a more comprehensive way. So Vittorio Buffacchi, who's a philosopher, says we should really think about violence as violation and violation of integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self. So you could experience violation of your physical integrity, but also your mental or emotional integrity as well. And this is, I think, consistent with how feminist activists have thought about violence against women, that it's not just those physical acts, but it's sort of a broader spectrum of acts that, you know, are connected to one another, but also reinforce, right, and bolster one another. So it's as important to focus on these sort of smaller, less visible acts, as well as those really dramatic, visible public events. So with that in mind, in the book, I tried to help us understand how this is different from other forms of violence and political life. So most of the discussion, at least in political science and in some of the electoral practitioner work, really focuses on political violence that's issue-based. So people are attacked because of their political ideas. And people can experience this as politicians, but also as voters, as activists. And it's a form of violence that affects both men and women and tends to be more common in places where the context is more, more violent. There's greater levels of impunity for violent acts. And this is a form of violence that could take gender differentiated forms, right? So in places like Zimbabwe, they talk about politically motivated rape. So it has a gendered form, but it's really about your political ideas. And the democratic costs of this type of violence are well recognized, right? We see this as a challenge to democracy, something that that challenges the integrity of the electoral process. In contrast, we think about violence against women in politics. It's identity-based. It involves targeting women specifically, and it's driven by patriarchal imperatives to reinforce a hierarchy amongst women and men. And it can also take gender-differentiated forms or not. It can involve things like murder or assassination, as well as things like sexual harassment. And what I think is most troubling is that we haven't really recognized the democratic cost of this type of violence, because it's often normalized as the cost of doing politics for women, or it's normalized because we normalize violence against women more broadly. So I want to help us understand that this is a new unarticulated form of violence. Of course, women in political life experience both of these types of violence and sometimes both of these forms of violence at the same time. but we want to think about the types of challenges that really target their participation in politics because of who they are, rather than the ideas that they're putting forward. So when we look at how the international community has thought about this issue, we see they adopt this broad perspective on violence, and tends to focus on 4 types of violence. So this is from the Interparliamentary Union's study on this. Includes things like physical violence, psychological violence, and sexual violence, which appear in the UN's Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and then economic violence, which was added by the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention. And just from this early study, we can see that women around the world experience all 4 types of violence, but that psychological violence is particularly prevalent, right? Almost 4 out of 5 women in the study reported experiencing that personally. But the numbers for the other forms of violence are not small either, right? It's between 1/5 and 1/3 of women in that survey. So in my book, I give some examples of what those 4 forms of violence look like around the world, but also add a 5th type that I think is not captured by these frameworks. So just to give you, just a quick overview, I think physical violence is easy to understand, right? Things like murder, kidnappings, and beatings. Psychological violence would involve things like threats, death threats, rape threats, and the sort of the data that we have on this problem really highlights the problem of online abuse, so on social media channels in particular. And so that's experienced by women across the world. Sexual violence has really come into greater focus in the wake of the Me Too movement, both sexual assault as well as sexual harassment in political spaces. And in this case, also against, especially women serving as political staffers. Economic violence, I think, is less well known, but it involves the use of sort of access of economic resources as a form of intimidation and control. So I think we could think about that in terms of things like property damage, for example, destroying women's campaign materials, attacking their offices, destroying their homes. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon in various parts of the world. And it's really about attacking women's economic livelihood as a way of getting them to withdraw from public life. It's not sustainable to stay in politics because of these types of attacks. And then finally, the additional form of violence I want to add to the conversation is what I call semiotic violence. And it works a little bit differently than the other forms of violence, but basically it is the use of words and images to degrade women in public life as women. So it's often, the spreading of sexualized images, for example, through Photoshop, through, various forms of gender disinformation. So we're seeing a problem in the United States with that, with the use of deep fake technologies to frame women in ways that make them look incompetent or undeserving of political leadership. And semiotic violence, sometimes it targets the women who are portrayed, but it's really about affecting public attitudes, public perceptions about women in politics as, well, worthy human beings, but also as political actors. It's about attacking their legitimacy and their competence to serve in these public roles. Okay, so then what do we do about this? So I, in the book, I talk about those different forms of violence and specific interventions for each of those. And then I have a chapter that looks at cross-cutting solutions across different forms. But I've sort of rearranged this by actors so that we can sort of think about what different people could do in relation to this problem. The underlying thread across all of those solutions, though, was the issue of awareness raising, right? So we're back to the problem with no name. We need to name it. We need to share the definition and understanding of this problem. So some of the examples of people who've done that would be things like the National Democratic Institute's Not the Cost campaign. It's a global campaign to denormalize violence against women in politics, to say that it is not or should not be the cost of women's political participation. We also have women coming together to write open letters, manifestos, published in different places. And then you just have ordinary individual women talking about their experiences, either giving public presentations or publishing books about their experiences. If we look at some of the things that global and state actors can do, the UN has really stepped up its efforts in this area. So one example is this UN General Assembly resolution from 2018 that recognizes, puts the concept on the UN record. There's also the recent ILO Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work, which contains some really interesting ideas about work that are very much applicable to politics as a place of work, as a non-traditional type of workplace. We also see, especially in Latin America, efforts to legislate on this issue. Bolivia is the first country to have a standalone law to criminalize political harassment and violence against women. A number of other Latin American countries have followed suit, so much so that the Organization of American States convened a series of consultations to develop an inter-American model law to use those best practices to support those efforts. Things that parliaments have done include things like the UK Parliament setting up a specialist team in Parliament to investigate these types of attacks. And I think it's really interesting that a disproportionate number of the cases they deal with are cases targeting women and people of color. We also see efforts to try to develop codes of conduct that are really about trying to shape the culture of Parliament, to say that these forms of violence and harassment are not acceptable conduct in the parliamentary workplace. Many society-led initiatives I'll just highlight here. Things like the work of Labor 2 to really sort of collect women's experiences to provide an alternative venue for reporting their experiences, which were then used to inform a report to party leaders on how to address the issue of sexual harassment in the party. One of my favorite examples of online interventions is ParityBot, which was developed initially for Canadian elections, but is currently was just piloted for the US and New Zealand elections. And basically it uses machine learning to detect moments of when female politicians are receiving abusive tweets, and then it automatically tweets out positive tweets, right? So it's like trying to counter the negativity with positivity and encouraging trends. We also see efforts by different groups, like the National Democratic Institute also developed a safety planning tool for women who want to be engaged in public life. So to sort of think about some of the ways in which you could assess your risks and then take active steps to counteract them. And then we have cases like FIDA Kenya, which is a federation of women lawyers that developed an SMS reporting system where people could report acts of violence against women during the elections and then be connected to the police or to legal support to deal with those cases. And finally, we see many individual-led strategies to address this problem. And I think one of the best cases in the United States is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, over the last few months has really spoken up about the abuse that she's experienced at the hands of her colleagues, as she did in a really famous, well-received floor speech this summer. On Twitter, she often speaks back to her trolls and to media coverage that is abusive and involves gender disinformation. And she also very open in giving magazine interviews. Most recently, I have some clips here from the Vanity Fair article she gave, which just talks about this experience and how much it affected her and why she still continues to stay in politics as, and how these experiences are gendered. So these experiences led her to join some other colleagues to introduce this historic House resolution 1151 just the other month, which recognizes violence against women as a global phenomenon, including in the United States. So I'll just end with this slide, which is I think, my own contribution to this debate, which are a couple of online tools to capture the fact that this is an ongoing conversation. So places to sort of share further studies, further strategies, new stories coming out. One is a Twitter feed called VAW Politics, as well as a website which includes like the up-to-date list and links to research and reports and emerging solutions on this issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mona. The book looks incredible and possibly the most in-depth snapshot, if those two things are compatible, that we have at the moment. I will just reflect really quickly on a few things that you've said and a few things I've picked up from your book. I think firstly, it's hugely important that women are beginning to talk about this and to collectively acknowledge that it is a problem. We often think it's worse in the country in which we live and where we're experiencing it ourselves, but it's very, very clear that it is a global problem. We may even have some hot takes from Rosalie on the recent US election as well shortly. But you also argue that violence against women in politics is not just a gendered extension of the kind of violence and abuse that already exists in politics, but that it is a very distinct issue that involves clearly a very broad range of harm and serves to undermine women as political actors and undermine girls and young women who may be considering careers in public life or in public facing or political roles. And therefore we are choking off also a pipeline of future public servants. Unfortunately, when we draw attention to this issue, we do hear both the women themselves experiencing violence and those engaging in the debate say it's just the cost of doing politics. And that seems to me to be an incredibly damaging narrative if we allow that to continue. But I think what you're also saying is that there is a separate phenomenon, if you like, which is that it's a hidden problem for very complex reasons. And many of those are to do with the ways that women self-censor and how women rationalize or tolerate the hurt and the abuse that they're receiving. I'm really interested in the ways in which women, indeed very experienced politicians, maybe Maria can talk about this as well, how they take a strategic decision to refrain from exposing what they're experiencing, partly for fear of reinforcing those stereotypes of women as being weak or complaining or hysterical or whatever. Or, and I've heard this from female elected officials in the UK, from being part of the problem. I've heard female members of parliament say that they have refrained from logging or reporting incidences of really quite extreme violence because they don't want to be part of the problem. Obviously, calling out sexism and misogyny is very, very difficult. And I just found a quote from your book, which I think really summarizes this, which is the fact that most women, when faced with the decision to react or not to a sexist incident, prefer the least risky option of not responding at all. This is not due to personal failings on the part of women. Rather, it stems from traditional gender roles which socialize women to defer to others and maintain relationships at all costs. I think that's probably sounds familiar to us all. Consequently, while self-silencing may appear to be a choice, it's done within a social context that can impose negative consequences for speaking one's own voice. And I think if we allow that to take root, and particularly with the younger generation, that could be catastrophic for our democracy. And certainly at the Jo Cox Foundation, we've argued for the need to engage the wider public in understanding the manifest ills of violence against women in politics, the impact, of course, on the woman, her network, her staff, her family, those around her, but actually on her ability to be a elected official who can engage in democratic processes and in the legislative process without fear of retribution. In that sense, it is so inherently damaging to our democracy and therefore to our society that I think that lack of a receptive audience that you talk about and that lack of language to describe their experience, which can really, I think, convey to the public and to wider society why this matters. I think we really need that to be part of the solution. So thank you for this incredibly important book. I think it will galvanize us into action. And I know that as women, we like to talk about solutions. And so I would like to now move on to our brilliant panel to hear their reflections. Firstly, to Maria Miller, MP for Basingstoke. Maria was first elected in 2005 and since 2010, getting into government, has held numerous positions, including Minister for Disabled People at the Department for Work and Pensions, later Secretary of State for Culture and Minister for Women and Equalities. We also know Maria as the brilliant chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee. And she did such amazing work whilst in that role. She's will, I know, have some incredibly interesting things to say on this. And she also sits on a number of all-party parliamentary groups, including Women in Parliament and Domestic Violence. So Maria, if I could hand over to you for your thoughts, please.
Catherine, thank you. And as a UK parliamentarian, I have to start with the fact that having someone murdered is incredibly shocking, but having somebody murdered who also does the same job as you, as Jo Cox did, is actually frightening for your family. And my family were frightened for me on the 16th of June 2016, when a fellow British MP was murdered in the midst of a febrile election. And I think that the fact that I, as a British politician, somebody who is a member of the oldest parliament in the world, is on this panel today, I think shows you this is an issue that has to be dealt with throughout the globe, and I'm incredibly pleased to have been able to read some of Mona's book already and see that it's tackling this important issue, because I think there can be no shying away from the fact that we have a problem with still getting women into politics throughout the world. And when I first stood for Parliament in 2001, all of my female friends, bar none, said, why? Why would you want to do that and put yourself in that position of being open to attack? And that's what was said to me time and time again. And I'm sorry, but I have to say that again, 15 years later, that is what my female friends say to me, having perhaps seen a little bit of what I, as one of the, well, actually the 265th woman to ever be elected to my parliament, having seen what it's like to have a friend who has a position in parliament and the problems year in, year out that they face. But without those female voices in political discourse, we've got a democracy that only represents half of the population. So this isn't something we can choose to shy away from. And recruitment and retention of female parliamentarians is really difficult for all parties. And if you look at the statistics on this, in the UK particularly, we may have growing numbers of women in Parliament, but they tend to stay for much shorter periods of time. And at the last election, too many of my fantastic colleagues resigned from Parliament, not because they felt that they needed to retire, but they felt that they didn't want to put up with the abuse that they had been plagued with, particularly in the Brexit Parliament. And I think that that's why I find Mona's book so interesting, because her analysis is not simply focused on the physical violence that women face. And I started off by recounting my shock and my family's shock at the death of my colleague Jo Cox. But the invidious forms of intimidation that women face day in, day out are absolutely more in number, greater in number than those that are experienced by my male colleagues. But I think we have to be careful not to completely write off that intimidation that male politicians experience. If we do that, then we undermine our own arguments. And I think this is a problem across the board. But those subtle forms of intimidation are, I think, probably more devastating, because they are not unlawful, but they are absolutely there to try and remove women from public office. Now, the government in the UK has identified the need for legislation to protect candidates when the power differential is at its peak. But what they haven't done is to look at, because it is difficult for governments to do this, particularly in free and open democracies, how we can put in place a better legislative framework to protect sitting members of parliament or elected officials of any type, because of the fear of it being seen as being obstructive of democracy and the transparency that is increasingly important. So one of the solutions that I want to see is better reporting mechanisms, more subtle reporting mechanisms for people who are affected by violence, who are in public office, and also a better monitoring of how effective the response to that is. Mona kindly highlighted a tool that's being used in the UK Parliament, which is including monitoring online accounts. But what we're not seeing out of that is any reporting of what happens and the action that's taken. It's just anecdotal and hearsay. Sorry about that. And so we need to make sure that it's clearly set out, the actions are being taken. I know that there are people sitting in prison now because of the intimidatory action they've taken against some of my colleagues, but it isn't reported, and there's no clarity on what is happening. Secondly, the second action I'd like to see taken is within the online harms bill the government in the UK is going to be bringing out shortly. There is an opportunity there to try and address some of the issues that have been debated today or been brought up today, certainly on a domestic level. But of course, the gold standard and the third area, which I think needs real action, is globally, because through networks like the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, I speak to women MPs and elected representatives throughout the world, and I will never forget a woman who represents rural Pakistan talking to me about the online abuse she experiences in her daily life. And I have to say, it echoed exactly what we experience here in the UK. So whatever solution, particularly online, is put in place, needs to be looked at on a global level. And in closing, I would just say there is a huge democratic cost in not tackling this, and our democracy doesn't operate if it doesn't include everyone. I would in context say that most of our parliaments and our democracies were designed for men by men, or by men for men, and women have in many ways been retrofitted. And therefore, I think this has to be part of a much broader modernisation of parliamentary democracies across the globe to make sure that women aren't sort of retrofitted into what is the most crucial way that we organise our lives, our democracies.
Thank you, Maria. Absolutely brilliant. And indeed, I direct people to your gender sensitive Parliament report, which contained many recommendations around that last point you made, which is that our actual institutions, and even physically so, are not built for women and for women's lifestyles. Thank you, Maria. And Rosalie Keach, Chief Observer to the UN League of Women Voters in the US, we're thrilled to have you. Since 2011, I believe you've held your post collaborating with UN agencies, member states, NGOs on increasing women's leadership and participation in democratic political processes in the US, promoting democracy around the world, and of course, preventing violence against women and girls. You're also on the advisory board for the International Centre for Assault Protection, and you have served on the exec committee for the NGO Committee on the Status of Women and the steering committee on the Working Group on Girls, including being chair of the Girls Against Violence Task Force. So we would love to hear your insights on Mona's findings and Maria's comments as well, and your own insights, particularly in light of the US election. Oh, you're on mute, Rosalie. One of us had to do it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to share some thoughts and hear the colleagues of insights. It's amazing what we hear on a everyday basis and how it tracks to what is happening, on the ground, specifically in the UK, and the research behind it. Incredible. So I have some remarks that I'm going to read, and that's hopefully we'll have time for questions and comments. When women are in leadership roles, they make a difference that benefit whole societies. As former Secretary Ban Ki-moon indicated, quote, where women are educated and empowered, economies are more productive and strong. Where women are fully represented, societies are more peaceful and stable, end quote. The Interparliamentary Union, IPU, has found that women politicians give more attention to social welfare and legal protections and improve trust. Women are often dynamic leaders of change, galvanizing women and men to get involved, claim their rights, strengthen their communities, and protect their planet. Their participation is fundamental to democratic governance. Let's take the case of Rwanda, that experienced a growth in parliamentary seats held by women in 1995 after the close of the Rwanda Civil War. In 1995, 4.3% of parliament members were women, and Rwanda's gross domestic product, GDP, was at 2.4 billion. In 2008, when Rwanda's parliament reached parity, the GDP went to 5.4 billion. And in 2019, women hold 61% of the seats, and GDP grew to 11.4 billion. Economic growth grew by 475% when Rwandan women became parliamentarians. Yet women's participation in politics is diminished when subject to violence and threat against themselves and their families. These tactics and other forms of sexual harassment are usually manifested in vile social media campaigns that malign the individual and threaten not only the individual, but democracy itself. Dr. Dubravik Simonovic, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, said, quote, "Make no mistake, this is gender-based violence, and its goal is stopping not just the individual specifically targeted, but all women from expressing their political voice and agency," end quote. And it is happening on many different levels of government around the world. As Mona mentioned, on the national level, IPU's survey in 2016 indicated that 44.4% women parliamentarians experienced threats of death, rape, beatings, or abduction against themselves or their families. And in 2018, an astounding 81.8% of survey participants experienced some form of psychological violence. One European MP indicated, quote, "One time over a period of 4 days, I received more than 500 threats of rape on Twitter," end quote. Whereas one Asian parliamentarian recounts, quote, "I receive information about my son, his age, the school he attends, his class, etc., threatening to kidnap him," end quote. These tactics are not used only on women parliamentarians. The tactics are used with women members of the press and with other leaders that have a role in making our democracy stronger. Women of the press recounted similar campaigns of threats and harassments against them, and it just doesn't end there. We have seen in this past election cycle in the US harassment and threats to election workers, judges, and many of those working on the front lines of our democracy. The League of Women Voters of the United States has co-sponsored many events at the United Nations wherein this topic is discussed. And parliamentarians have recounted story after story about a similar pattern of harassment leading to threats, leading to acts of violence when the harassment or threats go unanswered. Many countries, including the UK and US, have laws regarding violence against women and specifically politicians. It is imperative that the perpetrators of these acts be stopped at the initial stages of the pattern before it turns into the violence. So what can we do? First, we can recognize that the pattern is the same and develop and implement laws regarding the illegality of harassment and threats, not only against the individual, but also against the state. It is not free speech when there is an intent to cause harm to a politician. The harm is done when not only individuals commit the harassment or threats, but also when media, including social media, amplifies the message. Second, shine a light on the acts of harassment or threats and hold perpetrators and enablers accountable. Lastly, holding perpetrators and enablers accountable can be done on multiple fronts. Certainly, law enforcement and judiciary can prosecute perpetrators and enablers. Politicians can support civility in politics by discussing issues, not physical attributes. Civil society has a role to play as well. Do you vote for someone who is spreading lies, harassments, or threats? Do you share or retweet messages maligning women politicians? I'd like to end my reflections with a statement made by a woman parliamentarian in sub-Saharan Africa. I want to back up 2 seconds because this story is from a program we did at the United Nations with the IPU. Actually, it wasn't, we did the program. I attended the program and it was being done by the IPU. And we were in a room at the United Nations, which is a meeting room. It's not a big room. And the room was packed, jam-packed. And there were people sitting at the table, large round tables. And then there were people standing all over the place. And there were people sitting on the floor. And I was sitting on the floor next to this woman who I'm going to speak about. And she was a parliamentarian. And she told us about the threats she was receiving from a parliamentarian colleague. Her 4-year-old daughter was scared and begged her mom to stop her work in Parliament. And the woman told us, she explained to us that if she stood down, that her 4-year-old daughter and all girls will never have the gender equality and opportunities to live up to their potential. I look forward to the rest of our discussion and how to end this vicious cycle of harassment to threats to violence and how we can stop the amplification of the messages.
Thank you, Rosalie. That final anecdote, I think, is so powerful. It really highlights the sort of circle that we're in and that we need to break. The fact that a parliamentarian may fear for her life, or a public female figure may fear for her life, and her family, as Maria touched upon, may as well. And yet, if women do not put themselves forward, if we don't have that visibility, we fall at the first hurdle, I feel. And I often say visibility is everything. If you can see it, you can be it. Anyway, that anecdote has really given me tingles, but we've got lots of really brilliant questions coming in. So I'd like particularly to be able to hear from the panel on a range of things. And Mona, lots of questions for you, but I wonder if I could start with one that's perhaps quite topical, which is, to what extent do you think that divisive A, political events, B, political figures, or ideologies exacerbate violence against women in politics? And I think this links to another couple of questions we've had around misogyny generally and the correlation between particularly extremist politics and politicians and misogyny. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So you mean like misogyny more broadly in society?
Yeah, yes, I think particularly though, I imagine the question is picking up on a recent swing towards more right-wing politics, and the types of groups who engage in those ideologies, who tend also to engage in more misogynistic behaviors.
Absolutely. No, in my book, I actually have a section where I talk about, is this actually a new phenomenon. And so obviously there's, evidence to suggest that this goes back, as long as ever as women have tried to participate in public life, they faced resistance. But I think that there's the rise of right-wing populist movements, but also just broader increased political polarization, as well as, the development of online technologies have really created opportunities to, I think, like, the inspiration for these attacks and the tools to perpetrate these attacks are definitely on the rise. And so I think that that's definitely part of the discussion. I do want to highlight, though, that perpetrators of violence against women in politics, they come from across the political spectrum, and include men and women, of many different kinds of backgrounds. So I think that this is certainly, a huge driver behind many of these attacks, but it's not just a problem, I think, of extremist and populist actors, but also, a broader range of people who are trying to challenge democracy and gender equality, not respecting human rights by perpetrating these types of acts.
Great, thank you. Maria, did you have any thoughts on that point, maybe in a British context as well?
Yes, Catherine, I do. It's interesting to watch now, particularly following the general election in December. There has been I think, a significant change in the tensions in British politics, and not for the better. And I'll give you one example. And I think maybe this is becoming even more prominent because we now have record numbers of women in Parliament, still not anywhere near enough, but this is a real issue. And it was actually a campaign that was run around the funding of free school meals at half term, which put the party politics to one side of the rights and wrongs of it. The death threats that MPs had as a result of that, I have been staggered to see the divisive way in which feeding children has been used against female MPs, with a number of people actually now in prison as a result of that, is extraordinary. And I wonder whether there is quite an insidious way in which women's roles can be used against them as carers and as people who nurture children. And these sorts of campaigns are deliberately picking up on that as a way of trying to undermine women MPs in their roles. And I think if an analysis was done, you would find that far more women are not exclusively women being attacked on this, but far more women being attacked on this because mothers can say, how can you as a woman not be feeding children? So that I think is a really worrying trend in British politics since the latest general election. I wondered if Mona had a reflection on that.
I think that's a really, really interesting question, because I think that what's at the heart of this problem is about ideas about proper gender roles, right? So a lot of this, I think the origins, right? So it really starts with the basic fact of gender inequality and the idea that the public space is supposed to be a male masculine space, the private sphere is supposed to be a female sort of feminine space. And so it's really this sort of tension of women trying to, like you said, being sort of retrofitted into institutions that weren't designed for them. And so I think that's, a really intriguing point that you make about the fact that even when women are, we talk about traditional feminine roles, even in these public spaces, that women aren't doing their gender correctly either way, right? And that's, it really angers and motivates a lot of hostility. But it's interesting to me that the hostility is not just like, I hate your politics, you're wrong. It's more like, you stupid woman, why are you here? You don't belong here. It's not your right to participate here, right? And I think that those sort of policy-based critiques are completely valid. That makes politics robust, right? But when it's about who you are, because of who you are, you have no right to be there, to participate, to have a voice. That's when it really becomes challenging.
Yeah, I know that we will all be familiar with the argument that we regularly hear, which is that, well, we live in a meritocracy, therefore, you know, what are you fighting for, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very difficult to, well, unless you go into, you know, the history of patriarchy and, you know, the many, many centuries of disenfranchisement, of course. But it is a difficult, particularly in those countries where we are getting better at electing more women. This isn't a question from the audience, it's a question I come across a lot. I wonder what the panel's reflections are on how can we really adequately and effectively counter that argument, and say we still have a long way to go. There's a huge, you know, sort of counter narrative to the idea that quotas are good and can work. Mona, you are one of the world's experts on gender quotas in politics. It's a really difficult argument to land in the UK and in other countries where that meritocracy myth persists. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Rosalie, maybe to begin.
Sure. I think that it's important to stress why it's important for women to be in office. And I also want to just make a comment about the last dialogue. I think that when a person in office spouts out misinformation, lies, and harassment, it gives permission to others to act. And I think that that has to be stopped. And it has to be stopped legally. And it has to be stopped by the media that amplifies those messages. So it's something I feel very passionate about. But on this issue of women in politics, it's silly in this day and age not to have women in politics, not to have women in government, because of all the benefits. And the reason for including the Rwanda example is because it's linked to GDP. And, you know, the traditional roles of men, women, a lot of men realize and recognize the importance of economics and growth in economics. And that is a reason for women to be there. It saddens me that a nation that's talking about school lunches would have usually something that would have no discourse or no negative discourse would result in death threats. It's just absurd. And as a member of the League of Women Voters, I don't understand how we can't recognize that politicians that engage in that kind of discourse don't belong to be in office, and vote them out. That's simple.
It is mind-boggling. We have actually segued onto media. I mean, we can touch upon the meritocracy thing if you like, but I would like to get in another couple of questions, particularly around the semiotic violence that you've identified, Mona, which ties extremely closely, obviously, to the psychological violence. Firstly, what role do the media have to play, do you think, or what could they, you know, pragmatically and, you know, realistically do, and what could we encourage them to do in terms of reducing that? And secondly, is this something which is really playing out in those countries that are more technologically advanced, or are we seeing it in other parts of the world as well? And a question at the end for Maria from someone on the Online Harms White Paper. There isn't really a specific piece in there around violence against women in politics, or indeed any kind of gender-based violence against people in politics. But I wonder, how can we use the online harms legislation as a tool in this general fight that we're all engaged in? So Mona, if you could start, please, that would be great.
Sure. I'll just say something really quickly on merit. I mean, this is the issue that I could spend my entire day just to talk about. But I would just say that because of these traditional ideas about who is a political actor, that men, especially white men, older white men, are presumed competent, whereas women, people of color, young people are presumed incompetent. And I think that this doesn't have to do with objective measures of actual merit, because in work that I've done, the colleagues have done, finds that the women who come into politics are equally or often more qualified than the men who are there. Women are amongst the most active, most diligent legislators. And so this idea that, quotas would reduce merit, I think, is not held out by the evidence. There's even evidence to suggest that quotas for women increase merit amongst men, because now men have to compete more for those scarcer positions. So actually you have this sort of effect of like rising, increasing merit through gender quotas. But on the issue of semiotic violence, I think that, it's about silencing women. It's about portraying women in negative and, harming their personal dignity. And on the issue of the media, I mean, we have the whole problem of fake news, right? Gender disinformation, that is a huge part of the media landscape. And it's not just misinformation, which is just like spreading inaccurate information. It's disinformation. It's meant to deceive. And so I think this is a problem for sort of the media world. But on the issue of being technologically advanced, I think that, obviously to create deep fake videos, you need some technological competence. But, some of the interviews I did for my book suggest that you can do this in super low tech ways. I mean, it's things like putting up pictures in a mosque that, discredit, defame women who are running for political office, or, there's just so many different levels of semiotic violence that could be perpetrated in very low tech ways as well.
Thank you very much. And we're getting lots of questions in around the role of the media. Maria, would love to hear your thoughts on a few of those issues just raised.
Yeah, just briefly. I think from a practicing politician's point of view, I think the issue is less about broadcast and print media now, because you've got far more women in very prominent positions. And of course, in the UK, our broadcast media is highly regulated. The issue really is social media, which is totally unregulated. And in this country, not even deep fake porn is illegal. And this is a frightening thing for women in broadcasting as well as women in politics. So we have some shared ground there, which is why I think broadcast and print media can be our allies on these issues. The Online Harms Bill was really established to put in place a duty of care on social media platforms, and I've been lobbying mostly behind the scenes very hard to say that isn't good enough, because our legislative framework in the UK is not robust enough on online abuse. And so therefore any new duty of care has to go alongside a slate of legislative changes to be able to make sure it can work properly. And online abuse, I particularly focus on image-based abuse, which, outside of this particular discussion around politics, but it is pertinent to politics as well. And I think that there is huge room for us to use the Online Harms Bill as a lobbying tool for change in the law to provide more robust protections in the space for female politicians as well. As I say, my caveat is the reticence of our parliament, quite rightly, to appear to be providing protections for parliamentarians that aren't available to other people. So I think it has to be in that context. But there is a really huge opportunity there. And just to plug that, there's Jeremy, the former Solicitor General, has set up an all-party parliamentary group on this, cross-party. Jeremy Wright, sorry, his name escaped me for a moment. And we have eminent people from the House of Lords, and I think 3 former Secretaries of State, all working on how we can use this bill as a tool for good. So very happy to work with anybody involved in this conversation today on using it specifically for this issue, as I say, with the caveats that I've already said.
Can I ask Maria a question?
Of course.
Yeah, Maria, does the bill consider that online harassment and threats against women in politics and women in the press are harming the state or harming the country?
No, it doesn't. It's a very purist bill. Well, actually, it hasn't been published yet. So we've simply had a white paper process, and we're awaiting the government to publish the bill. But it doesn't. And I think the way you just framed that is absolutely spot on. It's about protecting our democracy, which I think too often we don't think enough about. In established democracies, we take it for granted, and we do that at our peril, we know. So I think there is a considerable groundswell of opinion that says that we can't take it for granted. We do have to protect. But as I say, I think the protections that should go into the bill shouldn't just accrue to politicians. They should accrue more generally, particularly in the way that online, that social media can devastate people's lives. And now the vast majority of people who have domestic abuse perpetrated against them, there is an online aspect of that. So this is something which I think is powerful. But I like the framing of your the way you just asked that question. I think it's very right, Rosalie.
Thank you both. Remarkably, we have gone beyond our allotted time because there is so much to talk about. There is so much that we haven't actually talked about, which is really quite frustrating. We've had some brilliant comments in the chat. Is it possible that there could be one significant set of actions which could prove to be a catalyst for change? Wouldn't that be amazing? But I do think we need to do that multilaterally and figure out how we do that. Mona, maybe there are recommendations in your book around that. I would just like to end by hearing from everyone about your hopes for 2021, really, in this context. And if I could begin and stick my neck out here with my hope, which is that we could actually build on this event. There are literally 20 questions I haven't been able to get to. I apologize. I wanted to talk about data collection. I wanted to talk about examples globally. Let's think about whether we could make my hope for 2021 come true, which is that we work with the Global Institute to continue this discussion, maybe with a longer event and have some dedicated segments on some of these really, really important issues. So Rosalie, could I start with you? Hopes for 2021?
I'll build on your hopes, Catherine. I would like to see the IPU included in that organization, organizing of an event or two, to help with legislation that could be drafted around the world, and also to help with the discussions that must be had with Facebook, Twitter, and the other social media actors.
Thank you, Rosalie. Going in order of my screen, Mona, please.
Well, I think you're absolutely right on the need for the global conversations. As my experience with talking about this issue is exactly as Rosalie mentioned, it's like people packing into a room, like it's just standing room only. I think that there is this like hunger to be able to talk about this this issue and just to have a language to sort of coordinate what you're experiencing. I think it's such an important moment to sort of be able to understand and to think about your own experiences, but also how you can use them in a productive way to make democracy better. I absolutely agree, and I think that there's a lot to be gained by these global conversations, because we see that there are different things happening in different parts of the world. I mean, the fact that the Organization of American States develops consultations on the issue of legislation, I think sort of shows you what can be done globally. And I think more trans-regional studies, conversations could be really productive. I just want to endorse what Catherine said about the multi-sectors, because I think that everybody can do something on this issue, whatever your role is. And so I think I would really recommend that everyone think about how they can be part of the solution moving ahead.
Brilliant. And Maria, please.
I just think that Mona hit it on the head. Everyone can do something. And I think in a time when in many ways, we've seen a kinder world during the pandemic, people trying to be kinder to each other in their communities, supporting each other. And I've seen that so much in my own community. Can we take that kinder world into a kinder politics? And I think it is by setting that sort of kinder tone of debate that women will feel more comfortable at being at the heart of it. I'm actually a member of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, a sort of a sister organisation for the IPU, the Interparliamentary Union, for those of us who need decoding sometimes. And we're doing a piece of work in preparation for International Women's Day, where we're looking at online abuse of women across the Commonwealth. And we're looking to try and have an international event on International Women's Day on the 8th of March to present those research findings involving parliamentarians from across the Commonwealth, which obviously is across the globe. The second thing practically that I'm doing is also working with the Interparliamentary Union and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association to encourage more countries to undertake a gender sensitive parliament review. Catherine was very kind about our review a few moments ago. I wouldn't be as kind. I would say it needs to go much, much further. And we now have 3 years have elapsed in the UK since that was undertaken. So I'm hoping we can undertake a new review in the UK Parliament, working alongside as many other sister countries as we can, so that we can try and get that modern framework within which women will want to be a part.
Thank you, Maria. And, you know, we'd love to support you on any review and progress report on the gender sensitive parliament. In fact, creating a more family friendly parliament was something that Jo Cox was passionate about. Thank you all so much for those closing remarks. I think to bring it back to COVID and the year that we've all lived through, if we can, see that kinder community spirit, vertical integration into our institutions and our politics, and a kinder politics, that would be a wonderful thing. And I think, as Jo said, for us all to recognise that we have far more in common than the things that divide us is the basic principle by which we should all carry out our public and our personal lives. But thank you all very, very much. And stay tuned, everyone who's signed up to this event, for future updates, and please buy Mona's book. The link has been put in the chat there, and that can be your reading over the next few weeks, and will help you make your own resolutions for 2021. And thank you to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for putting on this and so many other brilliant events. Thank you all very much.
And I already have it.
Excellent.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's probably easier to read on a Kindle or a tablet, I imagine. Thank you so much, everybody.
Lovely. Thank you.
Bye.